J.D. Vance pushed open the door to Maplewood Coffee House, a small, locally owned cafe tucked into a quiet street in Cincinnati, Ohio. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the faint aroma of toasted bread filling the cozy space with a comforting warmth. The morning crowd was already settled. Regulars who had carved out their own corners of the cafe, some lost in newspapers, others in quiet conversation. It was the kind of place where people lingered over their coffee, where time moved just a little slower. J.D. liked it here. There were no cameras, no political debates, no staffers rushing to brief him on the latest headlines. Just a place where he could blend into the background, sip his coffee, and be another face in the crowd. If only for a little while. He made his way to his usual table by the window, where soft morning light filtered through the glass, casting a golden hue over the wooden furniture. He set down his phone, flipped open the local newspaper, and took a slow sip of his coffee. It wasn't perfect, maybe a little too bitter, but there was something about the ritual that made it just right. Across the cafe, a young woman named Emily sat hunched over a pile of papers, her red pen moving quickly across the pages. A dedicated elementary school teacher, she had squeezed in a few minutes to grade assignments before heading to work. Near the counter, Robert, a middle-aged truck driver with a thick beard and weary eyes, sipped black coffee while staring absently at the news playing on the small television behind the bar. Meanwhile, Jamie, the barista, moved efficiently behind the counter, her ponytail bouncing as she took orders and wiped down surfaces. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with the kind of tired smile that came from too many early morning shifts. It was a scene of quiet normalcy, the kind J.D. found himself longing for more and more these days. Here, he wasn't a senator, he wasn't a political figure. He was just another customer, just another person starting his day like everyone else. And for now, that was enough. But peace is fragile, and J.D. was about to be reminded that even in the quietest corners, the weight of people's struggles is never far behind. The calm of Maplewood Coffee House shattered the moment the door swung open with a force that sent a few heads turning instinctively. The bell above the door clanged louder than usual, its sharp ring slicing through the quiet murmur of conversation and the steady hum of the coffee machines. J.D. barely had time to glance up from his newspaper before he noticed the shift in the room's energy. A man stood in the doorway, his posture stiff, his gaze restless as it swept across the cafe. He wasn't here for coffee, he wasn't here for a quiet morning. His presence cut through the warmth of the cafe like a cold wind, forcing its way inside. J.D. recognized the look immediately. The rigid shoulders, the clenched jaw, the way his hands were shoved deep into his coat pockets as if trying to contain whatever storm was brewing inside him. Michael, though J.D. didn't yet know his name, was not dressed for the chilly morning air. His jacket was thin and frayed at the edges, his jeans faded with wear, his boots, scuffed and caked with dirt, had seen too many miles. He looked like a man who had been walking for a long time, both literally and figuratively, carrying something heavy that he was ready to put down, violently if necessary. J.D. exhaled slowly, setting his coffee cup down without making any sudden movements. He had seen this before, not just in politics but in life. A person walking into a room, burdened by something so deep, so consuming, that they could no longer keep it inside. The rest of the cafe had noticed too. The older truck driver Robert, who had been idly stirring his coffee, stopped mid-measure, his spoon resting on the edge of the mug. Emily, the school teacher, instinctively lowered her pen, her eyes darting toward the stranger with a flicker of concern. Jamie, the barista, tensed behind the counter, her hand hovering near the register, as if debating whether she should call someone, just in case. The whole room, once steeped in the soft rhythms of morning, now felt as if it was holding its breath. Then Michael moved. His boots thudded against the wooden floor with each step, the sound punctuating the silence like a slow drumbeat. His eyes locked onto J.D.'s, unwavering and sharp, the kind of gaze that didn't just look at someone, but through them, measuring, assessing, challenging. Michael stopped a few feet away from JD's table, his hands still buried in his pockets, his shoulders squared as if bracing for impact. For a moment, he didn't speak. The air between them was thick with unspoken things. Frustration, exhaustion, maybe even a little bit of hope buried deep beneath it all. Then his voice cut through the stillness. "You got a lot of nerve sitting here like you're just one of us." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even an accusation. It was a statement filled with bitterness, with a kind of anger that had been brewing long before Michael ever stepped foot in this cafe. JD didn't flinch. He didn't immediately respond, didn't rush to defend himself or argue. Instead, he simply held Michael's gaze, as if inviting him to continue. Michael scoffed, running a rough hand over his unshaven face before shaking his head. "You talk a big game about understanding folks like me, about knowing what it's like to struggle, but you—" He exhaled sharply, his voice thick with resentment. "You ain't struggling now, are you?" His words hung in the air, settling over the room like dust no one dared to disturb. JD could feel the tension crackling around them, the weight of every unspoken grievance Michael carried pressing into this moment. A few feet away, Emily shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her pen forgotten on the table. Robert let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. Jamie's eyes flickered between JD and Michael, her expression unreadable but alert. Nobody was stepping in, nobody knew if they should. JD, still calm, still measured, finally spoke. His voice was steady, unshaken. "What's your name?" Michael let out a bitter laugh. "Don't do that." His voice was louder now, pressing against the walls of the cafe, demanding to be heard. "Don't act like this is some kind of friendly back and forth." JD didn't react to the volume, didn't let his expression shift. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging the weight of Michael's frustration. "You came here for a reason," JD said, his tone even, almost inviting. "Go ahead, say what you came to say." The cafe, though still silent, seemed to exhale slightly. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore, this was something else, something that could go in any direction. The cafe felt like a powder keg, and Michael was the lit match. His presence had shifted the entire mood of the room, the easy morning warmth now replaced with an undercurrent of unease. Michael's breath was uneven, his hands still stuffed into his pockets as if holding something back, maybe his anger, maybe his disappointment, maybe something even he couldn't quite name. His stare remained locked onto JD, unblinking, unwavering. "You talk about knowing people like me," Michael continued, voice cutting through the stillness. "But you don't. You left. You got out. You made your money. Now you sit here, sipping your coffee, acting like you still understand what it's like to barely scrape by." His words came out sharp, edged with something raw, not just anger, betrayal. JD took in all of it, the weight of the room, the weight of Michael's words, and still he didn't flinch. He didn't defend himself, he didn't interrupt, he simply studied Michael, as if trying to see past the rage, past the resentment, into whatever had truly brought him here. Then, instead of pushing back, JD asked again, his voice steady. "What's your name?" Michael's jaw tightened. He let out a short, bitter laugh, but there was no amusement in it. "Don't play politician with me." His voice rose slightly, the tension in the room crackling like static before a storm. "I know exactly how this works. You let me talk, you act like you're listening, and then you go back to Washington and do whatever the hell you were going to do anyway." JD didn't move, didn't change his expression, but there was something about the way he was looking at Michael, not dismissive, not patronizing, just patient. "That what you really think?" JD finally said. Michael scoffed. "I don't think it. I know it." He took a step closer. People tensed. Emily's fingers twitched against the paper she was holding. Robert shifted in his seat. Jamie's other hand moved instinctively to a damp rag on the counter, gripping it like she needed something, anything, to hold on to. Michael's hands finally came out of his pockets, but not in a fist. Instead, he pointed a calloused, shaking finger at JD. You ever had to count pennies at a register hoping you've got enough to cover a damn loaf of bread? His voice cracked, not with weakness, but with the sheer weight of what he was saying. You ever had to work a double shift just so your kid doesn't go to bed hungry? You ever had to watch your whole town dry up and then get told to just work harder, like that's some magic fix? His words didn't just hang in the air, they pressed down on it, heavy, suffocating. JD could have pushed back. He could have reminded Michael that he had lived through struggle too, that he had been the kid who barely scraped by. But he didn't. Because JD knew that sometimes the only way to really be heard was to stop talking. So he let the words settle. He let Michael's anger exist without trying to smooth it over. The café was holding on to the weight of it, bracing for the moment JD would finally snap back. But he didn't. Instead, he exhaled slowly and nodded. I get why you're angry. Michael flinched, like he had been expecting something else, an argument, a dismissal, maybe even condescension. But JD wasn't giving him any of that. Instead, JD reached for his coffee, took a slow sip, then set it down, as if they were just two guys having a conversation and not a public confrontation in a cafe full of strangers. You're right about some things, JD admitted. I did leave, I did make money, and I won't sit here and pretend I know exactly what's in your head because I don't. He gestured toward the empty chair across from him. But if you've got time, I'd really like to hear about it. The cafe collectively held its breath. This wasn't how people expected the scene to go. A senator getting yelled at in public? Sure, that happened, but inviting the guy to sit down and talk? That was different. Michael hesitated. His fingers curled and uncurled at his sides. His breathing was still heavy, his body still rigid, but there was something in his eyes now. Uncertainty. JD tilted his head slightly. You came here to say something. Might as well say it sitting down. Another pause, a long one. Then, almost reluctantly, Michael pulled out the chair and sat down. His posture was still stiff, his shoulders still squared like he was ready for a fight. But he was sitting, and in that moment, everything shifted. Michael sat stiffly in the chair across from JD, his hands clenched into fists before finally flattening against the wooden table. His breathing was still uneven, his eyes still holding on to the anger that had brought him here. But beneath it, beneath the frustration, beneath the resentment, was something else. Exhaustion. Not just from today, not just from this moment, but from years of carrying a weight that never seemed to lift. JD didn't speak right away. He let the moment settle, let Michael be the first to fill the silence if he chose to. Michael exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. What's been happening? He repeated, his voice thick with bitterness. Take a look around, man. Look at this town. JD did look. Not just in that moment, but in a way that said he had been looking for a long time. He had seen it before. The boarded-up businesses, the cracked sidewalks, the homes with broken windows covered by plastic because real repairs cost too much. Dayton wasn't the same city it had been when he was a kid. The factories that once kept families afloat had closed. The jobs that had been passed down through generations were gone. Hope had become a luxury. Michael's fingers tapped restlessly against the table. I worked at the steel plant for 22 years, he said, his voice quieter now, but no less heavy. 22 damn years. Then they shut it down, moved everything overseas, took my pension, took my health care, took my damn pride, and left us with nothing but a couple of sorry for your loss emails. He laughed, but it wasn't real laughter. You want to know the worst part? He asked, his voice breaking just slightly. It ain't just the jobs, it's what happens after. You see your neighbors lose their houses. You see people who worked their asses off their whole lives suddenly needing food stamps just to get by. And then you turn on the TV and hear some rich politician tell you to learn to code or just move somewhere else. Like, that's a real option. JD finally spoke, his tone quiet but firm. "And you think I don't get it?" Michael's gaze snapped back to him. He didn't answer right away, because now he wasn't so sure. JD let the silence linger before saying, "I don't blame you for being angry. You got every right to be. But I didn't come from a different world, Michael. I came from this one." Michael's jaw twitched, his hands curled into fists again, but not in rage, just in reflex, in frustration, in something deeper that he probably couldn't even name. "Then why does it feel like people like you forget us the second you get out?" JD didn't flinch. "That's a fair question." The cafe was quiet again. People weren't just overhearing a fight anymore, they were listening to a conversation they all had a stake in. JD took a slow breath. "You ever hear of Middletown?" Michael frowned. "Course I have." JD nodded. "That's where I grew up. I watched my mom lose herself to addiction, watched my grandparents try to hold everything together with pennies and prayers." He exhaled. "I lived it, Michael." His voice wasn't defensive, it was just the truth. Michael's expression hardened. But it wasn't anger anymore. It was something more complicated. Recognition. JD leaned forward slightly. "And you're right. I got out. But I never forgot. I never could. Because how do you forget the place that made you—" Michael looked down at the table, tapping his fingers against the wood. Then he muttered, almost like he didn't mean to say it out loud, "Then why does it feel like all of you do?" JD didn't answer right away. He glanced around the cafe, at the people who were still pretending not to listen but very much were. Then he said, "You know what the hardest part about leaving is?" Michael didn't respond, but he was listening. Ellie sighed. "It's knowing that no matter how much you try to stay connected, people will always see you as someone who walked away." He looked back at Michael. "And maybe you're right to feel that way. Maybe I haven't done enough. Maybe I should have fought harder for towns like this, for people who never had the chance to leave." Michael exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You say that now, but what happens when you get back to Washington? You go right back to playing the game, right?" JD shook his head. "I didn't get into politics to play a game." Michael let out a dry laugh. "Then you're in the wrong damn business." "I don't have all the answers," JD admitted, "and I won't sit here and pretend I do. But I'll tell you this. I came back here because I wanted to hear this, not from a poll, not from an analyst, from you. From people who actually lived this reality every single day." Michael exhaled a long, measured breath, his fingers still tapping against the table. His shoulders had eased, just slightly, but his face still carried the weight of everything he had said. He glanced around the cafe, noticing that the quiet tension from earlier had transformed into something different. People were still listening, still watching, but there was no longer an air of confrontation. Instead, there was something closer to understanding. The conversations that had been put on hold were slowly starting again, but not in the usual way. It was quieter, more thoughtful. People were still thinking about what they had just heard. Michael scoffed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Hell," he muttered, shaking his head. "I didn't come in here for all this." JD offered a small shrug. "But you did." Michael chuckled under his breath, a tired sound, half frustration, half something else. He leaned back in his chair, studying JD for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him or not. Finally, he pushed his chair back and stood up. He hesitated. For a second, it looked like he might say something more, but in the end, he just gave JD a small nod. Not approval, not agreement, just acknowledgement. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. JD watched him go, his expression unreadable. He didn't look relieved, he just looked tired. As the door swung shut behind Michael, the cafe seemed to exhale. The barista, Jamie, went back to wiping down the counter. Robert, the truck driver, took another slow sip of coffee, shaking his head like he had just witnessed something he wasn't quite sure how to explain. Emily, the school teacher, glanced at JD thoughtfully before turning back to her papers. JD picked up his coffee, took a sip, and let the moment settle. He hadn't changed the world, he hadn't solved anything, but maybe, just maybe, he had made one man think. And sometimes, that's where change starts. People talk about division like it's unfixable, like we're all stuck on opposite sides with no way to meet in the middle. But maybe the truth is simpler than that. Maybe it starts with listening, maybe it starts with conversations we don't want to have, the uncomfortable ones, the ones that force us to see each other as more than just our struggles or our beliefs. And maybe, just maybe, it starts in places as simple as a small-town cafe, where two men who should have been enemies, for a brief moment became something else, human to each other. What do you think? Can conversations like this really change perspectives? Let me know in the comments, and if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for the next one.